Hi guys, I just wanted to make a short video about the things that are going to be on your test, and I figured the best way was to go through your journal so you know exactly what things you should be studying or what things you should have prepared for when you take your test. So the first thing we covered when we returned from winter break was cladograms. You should know what a cladogram is and you should know how to read one. Questions about who is most related, so like the raccoon and the dog being more related than perhaps the dog and the brown bear because of the distance, the amount of time that has passed between those two organisms versus these two organisms. Also understanding how to read that these are characteristics that are shared. So for example, all of the organisms have a vertebrae, but then when it comes to, for example, a particular ear structure, only the organisms that come after this have the ear structure and these below it do not. Okay, understanding cladograms. Page 49, this is what I had told you from the beginning are probably the most essential vocabulary words to understanding this unit of evolution. You should have a pretty good understanding of all of these words, but in particular, the words natural selection, fitness, and adaptation are essential to this unit. Don't forget that an adaptation is a trait, something that increases your ability to reproduce. It is an advantage. It provides for an advantage over the rest of the population. Adaptations are selected for by the environment. That's something that always confuses you guys. The environment is the one selecting the adaptations that make it onto the other generations. Also, don't forget, fitness is a measure of your ability to contribute to the next generation. And what I mean by contribute is to have your genes make it to the next generation. So it doesn't matter if something lives 100 years if it doesn't have any offspring that live on to the next and following generation. The other word that comes up on the test a lot is natural selection. And really, natural selection was on page 50 of your journal. There are 4 mechanisms of evolution that you have to know pretty well. Mutation is probably the simplest of them all. That's just a change in the DNA. A biggest thing I want you to remember with mutations is they are random and they're not always helpful. They're not always harmful. This is the only way that, and I should have written this in here, that new alleles are introduced into a population. It's the only way that something new comes in. They're not always bad. Again, they're not always good. Sometimes they're just there, but they are random, okay? Gene flow and genetic drift were covered on another page, so I'll hold off on a second on that. But natural selection, after looking at the test, is such an important part of your test. Natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. And we had written a couple notes on here. Some individuals are more fit to survive and pass their traits to their offspring. Another way of saying this is survival of the fittest. Again, natural selection is something that happens in nature where the environment is selecting the best traits that allow organisms to survive and pass them on to the next generation. We had written some things about resources being limited, more offspring being born that can survive. I can't stress enough how many questions will be about this idea. Natural selection is a really important mechanism of evolution, so make sure you understand that and that you can answer multiple questions about natural selection. Gene flow and genetic drift. I'm gonna hop on over to page 52. Gene flow was simply migration. When an organism leaves its area and goes and mates with an organism in a different area, genes and alleles are going to get added and removed from populations. If an organism goes to a different area and the alleles are added to that population, then the diversity will be increased in that area. Now, for the area that they left, that they emigrated from, that area is actually going to decrease in diversity. So make sure you understand the role that migration plays in adding and taking away alleles from a population, okay? Adding and taking away from genetic diversity. Genetic drift can be broken up into the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. The founder effect, remember, is where a small population is started and they're the first ones to get there. So the secret here is that it's going to be the first organisms to populate an area. And then in the bottleneck effect, which is another type of genetic drift, and again, another mechanism of evolution, some event is going to happen like a fire or a flood or some kind of freak storm, and it's going to reduce the size of the population. And again, cause the population to be, this is important, less diverse. Same thing with migration. So keep in mind questions about decreasing and increasing diversity as related to these mechanisms. I'm going to go back a little bit. Page 51 was about the types. I don't specifically ask you for the types of adaptations, just understanding that there are structural, behavioral, and physiological. And again, I'm not going to ask you to name the types, but it's good to have, if you have an understanding of the different types, it's easy to understand why something is an adaptation. So you will see questions about adaptations as it relates to natural selection, okay? And then finally, the thing we covered last was the evidence of evolution, knowing that there are three types of evidences that we have. We have the fossil record, we have biogeography, and we have the homologies as evidence of evolution. There are not a lot of questions about this on the test, but there are a couple about each topic. In the fossil record, the biggest thing is the fossil record is incomplete. Lower fossils are going to be older than some of the more recent ones. If an organism is currently living and doesn't appear in the fossil record, it just means that it wasn't fossilized or it maybe didn't live at a certain amount of time. So fossils give us key pieces, but again, it's got pieces missing because it's incomplete. Only certain things have left a fossil behind, but it does offer some evidence as to how things have evolved and changed over time. Biogeography, we talked about Pangea in the last couple of days. The idea that it's the study of, biogeography is a study of life on Earth. Organisms that are related now live on different continents, and the only way to explain that is that at one point the continents were all merged together, and that's why everything has a common ancestor. And then the last one we covered were the three types of homologies. Anatomical homologies, where you have homologous structures, where it's basically, it boils down to structures that have the same structure, different function. So you have a cat's leg, a horse's leg, and then a whale's fin. You could add a human's arm to this. They all have different functions, but they have similar structures. They have the same bones that are present in the same order. You have a humerus, radius, ulna, humerus, radius, ulna. So they all have the same basic structure, which shows that they evolved from a common ancestor. But these are called homologous structures, okay? Different function, though. You have molecular homologies, and that's simply that more similarities in DNA equals more related. The more similar the DNA is, the patterns, the sequences, the amino acids, the more likely it is the two organisms are closely related. And again, if we count the differences, we can figure out relationships and common ancestry. And then the last one, developmental homologies, are just simply that in its primitive development form, everything seems to have similarities early in life, and then as we grow and evolve, we've evolved into something different based upon our environment, but our beginning shows some similarities. Those of you in pre-AP, you also have an added section on, you need to know the types of natural selection. You should understand directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. What I mean by that is, you have the graphs to show you that, but when you're talking about traits, we had used this example of white mice versus black mice and gray mice in the middle. In directional selection, it is favored to be either white or black. So it's when the two extremes are favored. And in disruptive selection, both are favored, the two extremes. So the difference between directional and disruptive is in directional, only one is favored over the other, either being white or being black. Like if all the rocks were, if these guys were all living on rocks that were white, then it would all of a sudden be very beneficial to be white colored, and then the black would decrease and so would the gray. So you would see a shift towards the white. That would be directional selection. But what if they were living in an area where there were black and white rocks? It would be beneficial to be white and black, and you would see a decrease in the amount of the medium phenotype, which would be the gray. So in disruptive selection, both sides are favored. And in directional, one is favored over the other. In stabilizing, there would all of a sudden, let's say they were living in an environment where all the rocks were gray, you would see a decrease in the white and in the black, and you would see a rise in the gray mice. So that would be stabilizing selection. So make sure you can answer questions about that. Those are all the pages that we covered in this unit. Of course, there's nothing to replace having been in class and having completed all the work, but I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of the pages that I thought were important for you to have in your journal and have a pretty good idea of what you recorded on what page.